I love applause at the beginning, you know? It sort of sets things up well. I'm really glad to be here. This history has been developed by a whole group of people, and so I want to start by saying thank you to the people who've been doing this work, because I have not done it alone. I happen to be the one standing in front of you tonight. There's the Hidden Brookline Committee. There's the school social studies department. When the social studies coordinator went with me to the archives, Ken Liss of the Brookline Historical Society, and especially the historians who've been writing about slavery in New England in the last 10 years. And then also I thank you, because there wouldn't be this history if there weren't people who cared about this history. Because when things get forgotten, it no longer exists. And so together we're going to explore the history, and I will be asking you to do what they call in schools turn and talk. Turn to your neighbor and talk about something for a minute or so, and then perhaps if you wish to share it with a larger group, and I'll be asking questions every once in a while. Because if I talk for an hour and 20 minutes, I don't want to see people half asleep. We can't control the amount of air conditioning we get in this room, so what you get is what you get. We've already asked about that. Now I want to start with Hannah Arendt said something that really sets the tone for me in all of this work. What she said is, long ago, we can no longer afford to take that which was good in the past and simply call it our heritage, and to discard the bad. So that's what tonight's talk is about, if you want to put it that way, the good and the bad, or just the complex history. Because it's not always useful to put judgments on it, but to just go, and so what is the implication of that? The talk will be 3 phases of freedom in Brookline for African Americans, and thus for everybody in Brookline. Because if African Americans are not free in this town, nobody is free in this town. Because you can't live part slave and part free, or part half free and part full free. We're in this together, no matter when we came. So the first part is 18th century, and that was a century of freedom from Brookline. If you were African American, your thought was to get freedom from here, to leave. 19th century was freedom through Brookline. And that was particularly the Underground Railroad and people coming through here. Though in both 18th and 19th centuries, there were a few free African Americans living in this town. The 20th and 21st century, gradually, haltingly, with difficulty, with protest, with unease, has been freedom in Brookline. And I'll tell stories from each one of those centuries, freedom from, through, and then in. Now I want to start by talking about the 18th century and the town. In 1773 and 1775, early 75, the men of this town, I can't speak about the women because their stories were not recorded, their words were not recorded to my knowledge. The men were angry and they were eager. They were ready for a fight against the British. So before April 19, 1775, the men declared Brookline free of England. Passed a resolution. We are free. We didn't wait till the 4th of July. But they also did something else in 1773. A tax on tea leads naturally to slavery. And we don't want to be enslaved. It's an intolerable grievance. An extraordinary kind of recognition. By the way, most, if not all of these slides are on our website, and I'm gonna give you a handout at the end. I don't want to give it to you before because there's some hidden secrets on there. And this is a journey of history hidden in plain sight. I guess I'm gonna have to move this over here.
What did they mean when they said unconstitutional?
They did not say. And I do not know because I'm not an historian of that time period.
Unwritten British Constitution, I suppose.
I suppose. I don't know if there have been any promises of self-government. Now, let me stick with the previous one.
It's okay?
No.
No.
Thank you. I like an audience that has an opinion. Back around 2006, I've been on the Underground Railroad Committee, which brought to light quite happily, everybody in town really enjoyed it, 3 known Underground Railroad sites. And I ran into Steve Bressler, then the Human Relations Commissioner for the town, at CVS. And Steve said, Barbara, you know, you really got to go look at that plaque at Town Hall. And I said, why? And he said, not going to tell you. You just got to go take a look. So I'm giving you a chance to go take a look and see if you see anything. When I first looked at it, let's see. It's a plaque that honors everybody who fought on the left side at the battle, who marched to fight at the Battle of Lexington. And on the right side, everybody who fought in other times during the Revolutionary War. So I looked there, and I couldn't find what he found that I should be finding. So I'm asking you, if you don't already know the answer to this, to look and see why Steve Bressler thought I would be interested in what was there. And if you haven't seen it before and can see what it is, let the rest of us know. It's something in the names that are there.
3 slaves.
Arthur, you're just plain old giving it away, aren't you?
I thought you were asking.
I was. I just said, if you already knew, not to see. So the 3 enslaved men, and we use the word these days, enslaved rather than slave, because it's kind of like a handicapped person. We're trying to keep the personhood of the enslaved person present, and then they're not simply a slave. So we have Esquire Boylston's Prince, Esquire Gardner's Adam, and Esquire White's Peter. And we have White, Peter, and Boylston elsewhere on the plaque. Well, I first went looking for women, then I went looking for names like Dukakis, and there weren't any such, no such animal existed then in Brookline. And that's how we established the committee. I went to the library. I'm a researcher by background. I'm a community activist also by background. I went to the library. I found 2 histories of Brookline. They were quite matter of fact about slavery in Brookline. I went, damn. And went to the Human Relations Commission, and we, in short order, set up the Hidden Brookline Committee, because things in this town are hidden in plain sight. And what I find amusing or ironic is that the DAR put up this plaque. And I'm also grateful to them, because if they hadn't, I wouldn't have looked. So what I want to now turn to is look more closely at those 6 men, and tell you a bit what we know about Adam, one of the 3 enslaved men. We have 2 tiny facts, and that is all. We know what he did on April 19th, 1775. And we know one other thing, that he is buried in the Gardner family tomb. Now you may think how generous, or wonder why they were being so generous. In the North, or perhaps in New England, for sure in Massachusetts, an enslaved person, when they became infirm or old, including too old to work, the family had to keep them on and pay for their well-being, minimal though it might be. It was against the law to release someone into freedom. And there was also an ideology of a certain kind of paternalism in slavery. We are doing this for them. And so even when they die, they will be part of us. But they are not listed on the tomb. None of the enslaved people who we know are in tombs are listed on the tomb. So those are the 2 simple facts we know about Adam. We don't know when he died. We don't know when he was born. Oh, I'm sorry, we know one enormous fact as well about him.
So he was enslaved to the Gardner?
He was enslaved to the Gardner family. We don't know who his friends were. We don't know who gave him his name. I'll come back to names a bit later. Who adopted him as a child? What skills Isaac Gardner valued him for? How much extra wealth he brought into the family?
Well, he
That same
was
is true for Peter, who was owned by Esquire White. We don't know if White Place, where Mary Elise lives, was named after that particular White. But now let me tell you about Prince. Prince is one of my heroes. Oh, this is a close-up of that bottom section. And also notice how they're listed as possessions. Like my jacket, which I may take off at some point because it's kind of warm in here. That's all they are for the owners. Now, the right side is what the ad looked like, at least when it got put onto, got sent to me. The left side is the way you can read it now. Would someone who's got a good, strong voice want to read it aloud to everybody? Mary-Lise, please.
$20 reward. Ran away from the subscriber on the 18 November last. A Negro man named Prince, about 27 years of age, 5 feet 2 inches high, had men's clothes on when he ran away. All masters of vessels and others are cautioned against harboring or concealing said Negro, as they would avoid the penalty of the law. And B, nota bene, it is supposed said Negro is gone to Salem in order to go a privateering. Brookline, November 30, 1779, Joshua Boylston.
So, what do you notice there? What do you find interesting about that particular ad?
Well, one thing,
Clothes on.
Sorry?
It says had
Men's clothes on. I've always been wondering about that one.
would you think it means like, quote, regular clothes, not quote,
Mhm.
slave clothes?
Or not a disguise.
Right, I mean, he may be dressed just like his master, of course. I don't know. That
Right,
would-
and his height was
he's
typical for
very
the age.
Very, really?
Yeah.
Really?
5'2"?
5'2"?
Yes. Yeah.
malnourished.
I thought maybe 5'2" and he had men's clothes on because he might be disguised as a woman.
That's what I thought.
Mm-hmm. He doesn't know how old he was. What else
Yeah.
do you notice there?
He's gonna go to the waterfront.
Sorry?
He's gonna go to the waterfront.
He's gonna go to the waterfront, which is a safe, relatively safe place to go. And if you go out to sea, you sign up to go out to sea, then you can't be caught. But this is only a guess, and a lot of people went to Salem.
What does that mean that it ran away from the subscriber?
The subscriber to the newspaper, this was a
Oh,
newspaper ad.
okay.
And in colonial times in Massachusetts and New England, newspapers thrived and succeeded in part on the basis of runaway slave ads, as well as ads for selling of enslaved people.
There must have
They were an
been,
important source of revenue.
there
Yeah.
must have been a fugitive slave law.
That's the other thing that's noticeable there, that there must have been a fugitive slave law. Not as powerful as the one in 1850, but an earlier one. So it's also a warning, do not help this man.
Who's that?
We never,
Was $20 on a big reward?
Yeah, it sounds like that was a lot.
I haven't found that out yet, because the money changed at around that decade, and it still confuses to me. Because my field is actually African studies, and I got into this simply out of the passion of it. The other thing that, subscriber means he was a subscriber to the newspaper. And he clearly had not been born in Boylston, unlikely to have been born in Boylston's family, which means that he had already been, that he had been sold at some time in his young life. So let me go on. So he's one of my heroes, because here is a man who may well have heard the Declaration of Independence, since he was enslaved to a very prominent political family. And he simply decided, or conditions may have been just unbearable, that he too was going to get his freedom.
Why would they assume in order to go privateering? Was that a common
That was a
thing
common
for
thing.
a runaway slave to do?
Yep,
What does privateering mean?
that means to go out in a ship.
To capture British ships
Yeah.
or enemy ships.
So, oops, before we get to that.
Licensed pirate.
So
What
now,
was an enslaved
I-
man worth?
sorry?
What was an enslaved man worth?
We'll get to that in a little bit with Edward Devotion. Now, let me tell you what we know about Esquire Gardner, since we know, that's what we know about, we've known about Adam and Peter and Prince. Esquire Gardner, you could write almost a book about Esquire Gardner's life from the resources that are there. In fact, there was an article written 100 years after he died. We know where he was born. His mother was Susanna, his father was Isaac Sr. He graduated in the class of 1747 from you-know-which university. As an adult, he lived on Chestnut Hill Ave. He was married, had at least 4 children. He told us his children's names. We know how he died. And how he helped his community. He was town clerk for almost 20 years and selectman for 7, a church leader, extremely wealthy, owned a large land in the center of town, and he enslaved 2, maybe 3 adults that we know of. So what we know about his life compared to what we know about Adam and Peter and Prince's lives is in some sense an historical tragedy for us. And that's part of what makes it difficult to imagine this history in our lives.
Was Prince captured as a result
No.
of this?
Not as far as we know. Of course, something could come out later, but there are no records in the town saying that. Now, I want to go back to look at freedom in Brookline and freedom in Massachusetts and slavery more largely in the 18th century. Massachusetts, by 1638, perhaps earlier, a ship prophetically named the Desire brought a group of enslaved men to Massachusetts, and the governor Winthrop recorded that in his diary. And telling you a story about how we're still uncomfortable with that history, when the Massachusetts, what's it called? Not the Historical Society, the other one. Anyway, one of the some kind of heritage and art genealogy place. That's it, thank you. They announced, and I was on their mailing list, that a book was coming out listing everybody who lived in Massachusetts before 1700. I was quite excited because we did not have all of the names that I knew had been there. So I wrote and I said, so will you have the names of the enslaved people in there? And they wrote back and said, there were none. Maybe it wasn't 1700, but it was 1650 at least. And I wrote back and said, we're 2. And they wrote back and then I gave them the source of information. And then they wrote back and said they knew an African-American historical researcher who used their archives a lot. So I wrote to her and copied this saying, and she wrote to them and said, why are you using my name? You know, what's the problem here? So what I'm saying is we're still uncomfortable. They then finally said, we don't know the names. And I said, well, we know some of them. And they said, well, they didn't have last names. And so it goes. There are times when it's easy to laugh, but there are also times, and I've had some of them recently, when our difficulty with dealing with slavery is not so easy to laugh about. So, Brookline, we were the first state to legalize slavery, to put it into the legal code so that it could be properly adjudicated and go to courts for different kinds of things, who had which kind of rights and who had no rights.
When did that happen?
Sorry?
When did that happen?
I don't know, but it was in the 17th century.
1641.
Somebody knows that? Could you say that louder?
It's 1641.
1641, thank you. Okay, Brookline, when did slavery begin in Brookline? We don't know. But we do know that by 1675, a business partnership of two families bought from the state of Massachusetts 7 Native Americans, men, to sell to the Caribbean. Why? Because they wanted to, the government wanted to get them out of the state because they were afraid of a rebellion of young men or a war. And they were sold down to the Caribbean. Often Caribbean slave plantation owners said, I'm not sure we want these people either. And so at one time, some of them actually were came back to Massachusetts. So that was the first slavery here that we know of. Slavery lasted until about 1800. It gradually died out.
Legal slavery.
Sorry?
Legal slavery.
Legal slavery.
Still
Thank you,
slavery, yeah.
thank you, Arthur. That's 125 years. Now, if you go from 1800, 125 years forward, so that you can have a period of freedom in Brookline, you have to get to 1926 to have as long a period of freedom or non-legal slavery in Brookline as you had of legal slavery. So we tend, because of the telescoping of the way we look at history, we tend to think of that as a relatively short period. But once you get up to 1926, the story, at least for me, becomes different. By the early 18th century, slavery was well established here. And I took a map from 1746 on the Brookline Historical Society website and then colored in everything that of slave, in blue is everything of slave owning properties. And you will all get a copy of this map before you leave. What I'd like you to do now is to turn to somebody around you and just take a look some more at the map if you'd like, or stand and come on up and look more closely if you'd like, and just talk about it with somebody else. You know, what comments you have, what ideas you have, just to sort of take it in a bit more. And I'll stop talking for a minute.
You know a lot, you've come to this lecture with a lot of freedom.
I asked some questions. I know something, but just general knowledge about American history.
Little Cambridge is Alston. Alston.
Which way is north?
So this is kind of like going to Harvard. So this is South Brookline.
Okay, so north is that way.
But what I'd like to think about here is associated with yourself is what difference does it make to you? Are you looking for names to see if that's where you live? Are you looking at the amount of time? What are you thinking about? So they followed me. That area was more like everyone else, I don't know. Maybe there was another area down there.
Yeah. Says Charles.
All right, enough of the talk. Okay, my unruly classroom, gotta come to order.
Where's the royal family?
They're in Medford.
I know they're in Medford houses today, so they're not gonna show.
They're not gonna show. Yeah, that's an extraordinary place.
Right.
Okay, I'm not gonna hand these out. Anybody else need a piece of blank paper while I'm at it? You're gonna have to stay after school, you know.
Right, I know. Right on the blackboard.
I will bring
Okay, now, comments. Any comments of, does this change the way you look at the town? Is this surprising? What do you think?
I think it's horrifying, basically, because I was born in Brookline, and my grandparents go way back in Brookline, and I never knew there were slaveholders in Brookline. I was always proud that we didn't have slavery in Massachusetts, and obviously we did.
Arthur?
You gotta also address the issue of how they deal with black people today.
We'll come to that.
I know, but I'm just saying, that, you know, we're saying back then, and maybe it was inexcusable because we thought that black people weren't humans, you know, and we could afford, or, you know, we could get away with treating them as non-humans, but it's happening today.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Other comments? Yeah.
I'm just curious, if this is Brookline, how extensive was the slavery in existence throughout Massachusetts? Was this uniquely heavy, uniquely light?
Great question. Boston in the mid-18th century was 10% enslaved people. Yeah. I just keep on getting these wow moments as I'm exploring more and more history. And what's been happening in the last, just a sec, Rob. What's been happening in the last 10, 15 years has been an enormous amount of scholarly research done on slavery in New England, particularly around Isaac Royal's home in Medford. It's now called the Isaac Royal House and Slave Quarters. It's the only existing slave quarters north of the Mason-Dixon line, and it's worth a visit. Rob?
The question is, how did you come up with that number? Because I mean, here we have 3 people, but was there a census or something?
How did I come up with Boston?
The 10%.
10%, oh, that's Boston, that's from a historian that I trust.
From Boston.
From Boston. And then just giving you a little bit more, besides just Boston and Brookline, slavery tended to be along the Connecticut River Valley for the obvious reasons of agriculture, and along the coast of New England, and that was in particular because of the usefulness of having slave labor for shipbuilding and other harbor tasks. It was also useful, as I'll come into in a moment, for people who wanted to get ahead in the world economically, politically, and socially. So central Massachusetts, it was much more rare. The other thing that, other comments or questions? Yeah.
I just have a question about, I mean, if women's voices were less heard in general, how much do we know about women or children who were slaves? I mean, it's...
I'll come to that in just
okay,
a moment,
okay.
but that's a great question. Yeah.
Well, the federal government in 1790 started the census, and Brookline has its own version of it. And don't they have those records?
Massachusetts did a census of enslaved people in 1754. What I found really interesting, in 1754, they found that there were either 14 or 17 enslaved people in Brookline, which was an enormous undercount from my going through just family records and that sort of thing. And the woman who did a wonderful book called Black Walden about slavery in Concord, she found the same enormous undercount. Why is that not surprising? Because they wanted to tax. And so they wanted to know how many people were owned. So guess what? Oh, geez, you know, none. And the numbers, it can be, so yeah. Let me then move on. Yeah.
I see the coloring is heavy to the right, and I think that's east, but it is not.
It's the
Total
north.
south orientation.
It's, the map should be tipped on
But
its
it's all
side.
predominantly to one area of the.
It is, and I don't know enough about why. One suggestion is that the land close to the Charles was marshland, which was good for cattle. And so cattle came in the summer from Boston to Brookline. So we were a summer community for Boston even back then. But it was also the first areas that were settled in the town. So I don't know how that played out in this. It's an unanswered good question. Yeah.
Where
No,
is-
behind you, I'm sorry.
So there's a lot of shipbuilding and ships here. I was under the impression that a lot of the slave trade actually originated from ships that came from New England.
Again, I think with all the comments and questions you're asking, I think I better move on to the next section. So, what this is roughly a third of the land, but just giving you Brookline data, it was roughly in the middle of the 18th century, 1/4 of the households were slave-owning households. There were one or two, and I mean that one, maybe two, free African-American families in the town at that time. And I have not been able to find out anything about them other than their names. But 1/4 of the house, there were 50 households roughly in town at that time. And 80 enslaved people is the number of people we have now on the list. And I don't know, I don't think that list is up on our website. Every once in a while we add or take out a name because we found that we double counted somebody.
What's
Sorry?
the date you're talking about?
This, I'm talking the middle of the 18th century, but in terms of 80, that's the whole span, from 1675 to roughly 1800. Now I want to turn to, first of all, the owners. Esquire did not mean you were a lawyer. Esquire meant that the Governor General had conferred a title on you, that you were a worthy gentleman, leader, and you were wealthy, and you were often a member of the professional class. So that's what this Esquire Gardner and so forth, that's where that meaning is. Now, why do people own them? It used to be thought that it was a matter of social prestige, so that you could have people to dinner and be served by an enslaved person. That is no longer believed to be true by historians. It is basically similar, the same as in the South. Money. That there was economic gain. There's one illustration that was all about business. We have the record of a nasty dispute over the value of a woman named Flora who was bought. And she was bought by Ebenezer Kraft for 105 pounds. He wrote to the owner and said he had been cheated. He wanted some of that money back. The owner said that Kraft was putting his name out there because he was talking about it a lot and ruining the other man's name. The case went to legal arbitration. This is in 1735. And Kraft was fined 15 pounds for making a fuss. So it's about money. The people who were most likely to be owners of enslaved people was professional people and people with large pieces of land. The professional people, ministers, doctors, and military officers, were people who wanted someone to farm their land while they engaged in their profession. So the first minister in Brookline, hired by the town government, because remember there was no separation of church and state in those times, Reverend Allen, he arrived here with his enslaved woman. The doctors, Dr. Zabdiel Boylston, a man who saved probably more lives than almost anybody before at least the 20th century from Brookline, saved lives in the country. And if I have time later in questions, we could talk about his story. It's an extraordinary one, as well as the story of the enslaved people who were part of that story. He had a number of enslaved people in his household. Then town meeting hired Esquire Sewell's, Henry Sewell's enslaved man Felix. Why? To clean town hall. And Henry Sewell was paid. So, besides the slave owners, we had slave traders here in town. Back to the comment here about slave trading being vital to the New England economy. George Cabot, one of our first US senators from Massachusetts, was a slave trader. Lieutenant Joseph Aspinwall was another one. There were a few others. What's significant about slave trading is that slave trading was perhaps either the most important or almost the most important economic activity in Massachusetts and Rhode Island in the mid and late 18th century. And big money could be made, there were big risks, there were huge profits. People would form consortia to establish, to buy a ship or put in shares in a ship. Several major institutions, Harvard Medical School, Harvard Law School, Brown University, Massachusetts General, the Boston Athenaeum, all were founded in part or entirely with money from slave traders. Brown entirely, Harvard Law School entirely, Harvard Medical School I'm not so sure, but for certain for part of it. So institutions that all of us use, some of them, in some way, or look to for medical research, we benefit from the slave trade, all of us. We are all the inheritors of slavery in this country. Now, what about the enslaved? What work did they do? They did semi-skilled, not just unskilled work. Shipbuilding was one of them, taking care of the farm, the cattle, the horses. The rights, they had basically none. Rarely could they give their child a name. The owner gave the child the name usually, and there were 4 types. There was the classical name to show how learned the owner was. Caesar, Venus, and so forth. Then there were the biblical names, and the favorite biblical names were the names of slaves, enslaved people in the Bible. Hagar and Dinah were 2 such names here in Brookline. Oh, by the way, Venus and Caesar were 2 Brookline names of enslaved people. Then there were names of slave ports. Boston, Ben Boston, and were 2 names in Brookline, and then Bristol was a name in other places. Then another one was a nickname. Jenny, Kate. Some people, and Jack, people thought was just a nickname, so they couldn't have a real name. And, but Jack actually is an English version of an Akan name from what is now Ghana in West Africa, of Aki. So there was an effort to try and maintain some connection with home. Occasionally, and more in Brookline much more in Brookline than in Concord, and don't know why, people were able to give names to their children from home. Sambo is a name from Senegal, is a Wolof name. It is not just, it became a name that had many significances here in the United States, but in itself, it is a name taking people back home. Another name that took people back home from here was Kofi, or in its anglicized version, Cuff. You might think of Kofi Annan, former Secretary General. And as I said, Aki. So there were times when people were able to, and the early slave trading came from the area around Senegal and Gambia. Most of this slave trading that came to Massachusetts came from around Ghana. And so that's why there was a shift in name. So I started thinking about what it is, trying to get to the heart of what it means to be enslaved. And I thought about what is the heart of what it means to be free. One of the things, just at the simplest level, is that you do work that you care about and that you get the value from. Another one is that you live with family or friends that you love. Now here in Brookline, thinking about the second one, family and friends, the slave population was 2/3 male. farm labor in the British sense was for men. In West Africa, it was often for women. And so they wanted male labor. And they did not need children because they did not need to reproduce the labor because there was enough labor coming in on the slave ships. So it was 2/3 male, 1/3 female, and almost no children. Then you add to it that, oh, and owners, I don't have any records of it in Brookline, but there are records in Boston of owners putting up notices in the newspapers saying that they were giving away children, small children of slaves, and you could come by such and such a house and pick them up. There were also ads saying, we will, you can come and buy somebody. What I've got here, so no one knew if they'd be able to stay in the community in which they grew up, or with the parents that they grew up with. So to me, one of the great cruelties of slavery is not just the labor and the cruelty of an owner. It is the cruelty of not having a social life. It was particularly strong here in Brookline. So I want you to take a look at this bill of sale and notice a couple of things on it. So he is buying Captain Edward White, again, we're White Place, is by a man named Cuff, which is from Kofi, the Ghanaian name. About 27 or 28 years, 80 pounds. And what we get down here is that he says in about 3 different ways that he has the right to this man, that the man who is selling owns him. And so again, it re-emphasizes the ownership quality of slavery. And so I will pay for it if there's any question about my right to own this man and to sell this man. And so Kofi was sold at the age of 27 or 28.
But they just estimated the age, right?
They just estimated the age.
Yeah, so they could have been totally wrong by many years.
It could have been, probably not by many years.
No?
A 15-year-old looks very different to me from a 27-year-old. And a 27-year-old looks different from a 40-year-old. But yeah, there is a range in there. But before we get to this one, I want to tell you that these people who lived here as enslaved people were survivors. These were people who had kept their humanity as far as possible and their dignity. And I want to tell you a brief story about one of them. It's a man named Primus. And he was serving his owner and his owner's neighbor. And the owner's neighbor decided to make fun of Primus. So he said to Primus, so which one is heavier? You know that where I'm going here. A pound of feathers or a pound of iron? And Primus said, a pound of iron. And so the two men started to laugh at Primus. And Primus is known to have said, which one would you rather have me drop on your head? I'd say there's a lot of humanity there, a lot of dignity there. Another story, we have very few stories, and we have to rely on such stories because we have been deprived of this history, all of us. A man by the name of Sambo, enslaved by Ebenezer Davis. Davis sent him into Boston to sell his famous, there's a painting in England of these melons with Ebenezer Davis standing there with it. He went to, besides selling the melons, he went to Davis's lawyer in Boston to pay him for his legal services to Davis. He gave the lawyer some money, and the lawyer refused to give him the change that he was owed. Sambo went back and had this difficulty of explaining to the owner that he had not cheated him, that the lawyer had. Some months later, Sambo's back in town selling Davis's melons. The lawyer approaches him to buy one. Gives him a nice big bill. What does Sambo do?
No change.
No change. He says, look, you kept the change before, so we're even. He brought the extra amount home to his owner and got his satisfaction back and kept his dignity. So now I want to turn very briefly to Edward Devotion House and Edward Devotion School. Devotion was not one of the wealthiest men in town. He was not an Esquire. He was known as Goodman Devotion. When he died, this was his probated property. In case you can't read it, and it's not, I realize it's not big enough for here, and this is shortened. I left out a lot of the whereases and so forth. Principally and first of all, I give and recommend my soul to God as my temporal goods. I give and bequeath my wife and my niece and nephew. They had no children of their own. In case my estate proves sufficient, then my will is, and I authorize the town of Brookline toward building or maintaining a school. And then here was the probated property. 15 acres worth 310 pounds, plus 7 acres worth 105 pounds, 1 Negro worth 30 pounds, 1 cow worth 14 pounds, and household goods worth 105 pounds. Down here in small print is an explanation that actually he had a lot more acres than that, because he had sold his acres to Solomon Hill, who had not paid back the mortgage. And as soon as the town of Brookline realized that Solomon Hill had not paid it all back, they confiscated the property, told Solomon Hill he didn't get a penny for his money he had given to Edward Devotion before, and they used the money for various things, including apparently a little bit towards the school. So, as I used to ask third graders when I take third graders on a tour, so what kind of a man was Edward Devotion? A good man? Because he made the largest bequest to the town of Brookline in the whole 18th century. And by no means was he the wealthiest man. But he was a slave owner. And we know from, or historians told me that the enslaved man was a healthy young man, because that was a high value for an enslaved person, worth twice as much as a cow. So I just leave you with that. And
What does a third grader say?
the third graders tried to open and close their mouths a few times. But that's where I wanted to leave them, with complexity in history. Now I want to turn to the 19th century and towards...
There was no way to trace what happened to that enslaved man?
No, we tried to, because we don't know if the enslaved man stayed with his wife, and I did not go and look through her will, because she may have remarried, which would be likely, and then it might be difficult. We don't even know the name of the enslaved man. Or did the town get the enslaved man and sell the man? Don't know that either. And there is no record in the town records. I've gone through the town meeting records from the 18th century, and there's nothing in there to indicate one way or the other. So, turning to the 19th century, freedom through Brookline. This is one of 3 Underground Railroad houses. The other one, I can't tell you, because we don't have enough time, about the Bowditch story. If we have time and answer, I'll tell you. It's a wonderful story. He lived over by Linden Place, and he was a man with a lot of guts and very little fear in terms of his rescuing somebody who was about to be sent back south. Instead, I want to tell you about the Philbrick House. This is a group of 4th graders on the lawn. And tell you about this person. For those of you who don't know this person, my first question is, man or a woman? Yes?
Well, since you're even asking, I'd go with woman.
We got somebody who was ahead of me over here. If she didn't ask, it must be a woman. And in fact, it is. Her name is Kraft. This is from done just after the Civil War. Ellen and William Kraft, her husband, made one of the most daring escapes in history. They traveled 1,000 miles to freedom from the middle of Georgia. How did they do that? They thought that that was too far to go as an African-American enslaved couple together. So Ellen's mother had been raped by her owner. Ellen was owned now by her half-sister. She decided, since she was so light-skinned, that she would escape as a white, but a white woman would not be traveling appropriately with a black man. So she had to double disguise herself. She put on dark glasses. She didn't wear glasses. She couldn't own glasses, in order to hide the expression in her eyes. Any ideas as to why she put on the bandage around her arm? Because it had been wrapped around her arm to hold it up like this.
To explain why she needed a male
No,
slave.
that's a good idea, but that isn't why. Sorry?
To explain why she needed to travel with a male slave.
That would be two, but the main reason was that she did not know how to write.
Okay.
And she needed to sign documents for his slave. And this would explain why he did not write. Then, which you don't see in this image done, she had one around here, around her jaw and the top of her head. Why would she have that?
No beard.
No beard. She had no beard. She would be traveling for several days on public transportation. They had saved some money because they were both skilled workers and they had been able to get a little bit of money. And she would not be growing whiskers. So it's Christmas time. There's a day or two when the enslaved people have freedom. And the two of them walked separately to the train station. She bought the tickets for them both. She got in the white car. She sits down by the window. She's waiting for the train to start. And she looks at who's sitting just sat down next to her. He's here. And the man says, "Good day, sir." I said, "Good day, sir." Man across the aisle saved her life. He said, "He's so wrapped up, maybe he's deaf too." She had served him dinner the night before. They had a number of other difficulties along their escape. They got to Philadelphia. They were told that wasn't far enough north in 1848. So they came to Boston. They lived on the back of Beacon Hill. And then the Fugitive Slave Act passed. And William was at Lewis Hayden's house on the back of Beacon Hill when the slave catchers came. It was now legal to come north and to take people back into slavery. And they pounded on the door, and Lewis Hayden said, "Cross the threshold, I have gunpowder right here. I'll blow us all up into the next world. No one returns to slavery from here." So they left to get a court order. They came without the court order. Ellen, he went to the South End. Ellen went to this house. Oops. Here in Brookline, the Philbricks home. What I'm doing is changing, at least the way I was taught the Underground Railroad story, I'm changing the Underground Railroad story. It is mainly not about white conductors. And it's not a tight organization. Sure, isn't mainly about Quakers. It's about courageous African Americans planning, figuring out ways, and sometimes succeeding. And then when they do it, that doesn't stop. They continue to do something to help their own lives and other people's lives. So when they were on the back of Beacon Hill, they were doing anti-slavery speaking, and they were using their real names because that was the only way anyone would believe their story, because it was so extraordinary. They left Boston and Brookline. People helped them to get to Maine and Nova Scotia. They went to England. They learned to read and write. They just agreed to have children. She refused before. They raised their children there. They spoke out on the anti-slavery circuit there. The Civil War came and ended, and they have a choice. They can live in the United States, Canada, or England. Where would you go? They went to Georgia. They hoped to find family there.
What year?
This was in, I think, the early 1870s. They hoped to find family there, and you know what they did? They stopped first in New England, thanking people in Boston and Brookline. I don't know if they came to Brookline, but they thanked people here. They set up a school, daytime for children, nighttime for adults who had never had the chance to learn to read or write. The Klan burned it down. They moved, they set up another school, and they set up a cooperative farm, and their descendants are known to us today. It's an extraordinary story, and I am waiting for Oprah to put this on film. It's a story of love, of courage, of resistance to extreme oppression, and extraordinary resourcefulness. So, now, want to move forward to the 20th and 21st century. Hidden history, again, right on Allerton Road, on Pill Hill. This is the home of, I bet someone here knows, other than Rob. Rob, go ahead. Roland Hayes. It's Roland Hayes' home. Roland Hayes is a pioneer, and he has made a difference in musical life for all of us. Marian Anderson, Leontine Price, many, many others would not be classical performers if they had not had someone come before them. Roland Hayes was that man. He broke the color bar with the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and
Symphony Hall.
He sang at Symphony Hall, but before he broke the color bar of Boston Symphony Orchestra, they told him he would never make it because of his color. So he went to Europe, as many people did later, made his fame there, and then this is a picture of him on an old, remember the library had those sort of funny posters, powerful posters. This is Roland Hayes. Before desegregation, before civil rights, before Symphony Hall, before command performance for King George, before changing the face of classical music, before going back to school, before reaching unprecedented heights, there was a solid foundation. He too was born in Georgia. In 1887, he trained at Fisk University with a 5th grade education and went forward very fast and came to Boston to do his final training, and then had to make his name in Europe before he came back. When he was in Europe, the first thing that really broke things through for him was when King George asked him to do a command performance, or maybe you don't ask, maybe you command a performance. And he was he happened to be sick. Maybe it was flu, maybe it was a pneumonia. He was so overwhelmed with whatever that he fainted when he got the invitation in the mail. But that did not stop him from going the next afternoon. The king thought he would stay for 15 minutes. The king was so entranced with his classical singing as well as his spirituals that he stayed almost an hour. That then opened many doors on the continent, including here at Beethoven's Saal in Berlin. He believed, or maybe there are records, I think, that indicate that an early Nazi party, or early Nazis in the 1920s, got wind of his arrival and put something in the newspaper that was insulting of him. He went to Beethoven Hall. He had reserved the hall. He had paid for the hall. That's the way you did it. Maybe you still do it in these days. Hoping that you sell enough tickets so that you make your investment back and that you become wealthy from it or make a living. He walked onto stage And he stood there next to the piano in the curve of it with his American pianist with him, took a deep breath, preparing to sing, and he heard it. The hissing began in the back of the hall. And it got louder and took over the whole hall. No one came to his defense. He closed his eyes and stood taller. He said he doesn't know how long it was, maybe 5 minutes, maybe it was 10 minutes. But it finally died out. And without moving his head, or almost his mouth, he told his pianist to begin with something different. And he took the Germans right where they were. He took one of their most famous leaders that's called A Song of Peace. It starts very quiet and then builds. And he started singing it. And the place was silent. So silent it almost hurt. But by the end of the song, the applause was thunderous and he had won. That's a man who in the 1920s, in that same decade, chose to live in Brookline. There was only one problem. No one would sell. He happened to be driving through Brookline and saw that a house of a friend of his was for sale. A friend he knew had died. So he wrote to the daughter in California and asked if he could buy her father's house. She wrote back immediately and said, I can think of no one better to live in my father's house. You have always been welcome there. And that is where he lived until he died, almost until his death. His death was in 1977. He received many honorary degrees. In the 20s, he was perhaps one of, if not the wealthiest performer in the world, extremely successful. Life was not so easy after the Depression and then the World War II. Travel was difficult, audiences were smaller. But he had made his mark, he had made his difference. And Arthur Conquest and Roland Hayes' daughter and granddaughter and others have worked hard to bring his name back to the town as one of the most extraordinary Brookline men that has ever lived here. There will be, what's wonderful is that we have received a gift, Hidden Brookline Committee has received a gift from the High Street Hill Association of $1,000, which is the exact amount, roughly exact, that it will cost to put up a bronze plaque in front of his house. We plan to have that plaque unveiled on Roland Hayes' birthday next June. Those of you who would like to join and work with the committee in a small, occasional, regular capacity would be heartily welcome. We are a small committee. We focus on our tasks, not our talk. We do good work. Just so you know what we've done in the past, we've done, let me move forward. We have put up a plaque. This was our first activity in 2009. It took several years. Would someone with a loud voice read this aloud, which will just help us slow it down because you could probably all read it. Who would like to read it aloud? Please.
Slavery in Brookline. Buried within the walls of this cemetery lie the remains of Adam, who marched to fight as a Minuteman on April 19, 1775, as well as Kate, Hagar, Venus, Seiko, Felix, Boston, Dinah, Charles, and Ben Boston, and of other slaves of African descent who lived in Brookline and whose names are not known to us. In their memory and in their honor, this engraving is dedicated. September 13, 2009.
Yeah, that was quite a day. Were any of you there? A few, yeah.
Where is this located?
At the old burying ground on Walnut Street. I can't remember what the cross street is, but it's right near Lincoln School. Sorry?
Chestnut Street.
Chestnut Street, thank you. Now, what I want to do is to tell you a contemporary story about how we look at slavery that relates to this plaque. Now, as you may have seen, the plaque is on the outside of the cemetery. When the Hidden Brookline Committee went to the cemetery trustees, at first they wanted evidence that there really was slavery in Brookline, because to them, as it had been several years earlier to many of us, so not all of us, it was new. We brought that evidence back to another meeting, and then they said they did not want anything put inside the cemetery. We then went back as a committee and, before that, when we said that there had been slavery in Brookline, the response of one of their members was, "You're trying to embarrass us." And that's what I mean by the difficulty of acknowledging that slavery is in our heritage, in our joint heritage. The cemetery trustees came around to a different point of view, but they had to work it through. And I'm glad that working through happened. And I'm glad that I didn't lunge across the table. Which I realize I was tempted to, and it's not a good idea. Anger often gets in the way of progress. Not always, but it often does. So we then met as a committee and said, well, we can get it put inside the cemetery because we can go to the town meeting and we will win. And then we went, but do we want to? And we realized that they'd given us a favor, unknowingly, that we wanted it on the outside so the public would see it. Because most of the people who go to the cemetery are dog walkers and teenagers hoping to hide their beer. There are a few others that go in there because of its historical significance. It's the old burying ground. And there's a wonderful website on the old burying ground with all of the people listed there from in an old list. So we put it on the outside. Then, you've probably noticed the 2009 date. Slavery ended in 1800 in Brookline, roughly. They could have put up a plaque in 1801. Why now? I think of 2009 as now. What do you think has changed? I'm not saying we're perfect. What do you think has changed in the since World War II? Yeah.
I was gonna say, we had a president right after that.
Right.
Sorry?
Just before that, we had the new president. And I wonder if that raised some people's consciousness.
We've been working on that before, but that's a possibility. What else might it be possible? Yeah.
I think there's been a gradual change in attitude about America's preeminent state in the world, and we also have our warts and bruises, whether it be the American Indian, whether it be the slaves, the black slaves, that now we know were just as much in the North as in the South. And I haven't had a history course since I was in high school, 50 years ago? And I'm sitting here saying the attitudes now about talking about repressive behavior that the American nation overall, however you want to describe that, on various peoples, that has emerged in an enormous way since I was in high school.
I think there's something else that a history teacher from devotion school, we did a pilot adult walking tour on slavery and freedom, and we asked this question to them, and a history teacher said something that I thought was quite wise. She said, America has this exceptionalism attitude, that we are different, and that our heritage is just the good things. And that has gotten in our way. And textbooks that do that. We had a controversy in Brookline about a 5th grade textbook. The parents were right to object. The thing got changed. It should have happened earlier, but it got changed. We had a hard time. So we have a hard time admitting that our history is more complex than democracy and freedom. There are other things too. And that is, we've had activists. We've had civil rights activists. We've had anti-lynching activists. We've had Ferguson. All of these things, and the newspapers are now reporting things that they didn't report before Ferguson. We're learning all kinds of things. Maybe we're not all learning it. Maybe only some of us are learning. All kinds of things are coming out that we're dealing with, because we're dealing with our slavery right now.
But were we dealing with it in 2009 as broadly as we are now? I don't think so.
No, I don't think so. But maybe our committee was ahead of the curve, maybe we weren't. But anyway, I'll leave that to you. Let me tell you one final thing about this thing. This is a hidden thing that's there, and that is that there are several words missing from the plaque. That the cemetery trustees told us that the plaque could not go up if those words were there. We then met after the committee, and this is going to be a turn and talk opportunity for you, to decide what you think of it. The words that are missing go towards the end. In their memory and in their honor, and with regret for their condition of servitude, this engraving is dedicated. So if you would turn to people around you, and then I will tell you sort of the thinking of the committee and of the cemetery trustees. So turn and talk to somebody and see what you And with regret to their conditions. Oh, no, I want you to just turn it. What do you think? What would you do at this point? One thing you could talk about is what would you do if you were on the committee at this point?
Then it would not be accepted.
Mary Louise, you want to allow Ruth Ann into the conversation?
Sure. I was just asking how often have we learned to stay away from but I was around.
Oh, it's not my fault, yeah.
And I think in a way that was sort of acknowledged that it was our fault. And they weren't ready to do it.
Do you think they might do it now? I mean,
All right. I'm calling you back together. Some comments, please, that you've shared in your smaller groups. So some reactions to the missing phrase. Yeah.
Like you said, I mean, I'm just surprised Brookline. Currently, people could say that. People couldn't accept facts, basically. Couldn't say so.
You were going to say something, yes.
Yeah, we were just talking about it, and I'm not really surprised that Brookline would be embarrassed. I'm not even surprised that the country doesn't really want to talk about this. They don't want to talk about this. They don't want to talk about the teenagers having a party in Texas the other night and how the police officer threw that rolled out of the ground. These are uncomfortable issues. So I'm not surprised that Brookline, Lakeland, we're educated, nobody wants. So we were also saying perhaps in another 15, 20 years,
Yeah.
Brookline will be comfortable with that phrase being added in.
Yes.
My thought is the word we read implies guilt, and that maybe these people were thinking that it wasn't our responsibility, our ancestors did that, and they didn't want to kind of implicate themselves in the guilt, and then maybe that was where they were coming from. Did they give a reason?
That was the reason they gave, and what we regret. We explained that it was, as in the military comes to your front door awfully, we regret to inform you. And I remember saying to the chair of the cemetery trustees later on, would the word sorrow have worked? And he looked kind of startled and said, perhaps.
What word?
Sorrow, instead of with
Okay.
regret, but with sorrow for their condition of servitude. You see, what's interesting is without that in there, whichever phrase, there is no response to the facts. Because what's there is mostly, the facts. So, one more comment from someone who's bursting to say something?
We're never going to move forward as a community. Brookline is existing 40 years ago, 1957, when Dr. King had the bus boycott in Mobile, Montgomery, Alabama. In a sense, that's where we are. Until we're ready to admit that we have some blemishes, we're not going to move forward.
Yeah. Let me just close with a couple of comments sort of along that line, that we need to find ways to talk. We need to find ways to deal with our own discomfort and our mistrust. And we continue to have racial problems in this town because we are not exceptional. We may be very good, but we are not exceptional. What the committee did, I forgot to tell you, what the committee did is two of us who had been at the meeting with the cemetery's trustees went back to the committee, and it was a multiracial committee, lively people, different kinds of opinions, and a committee that worked really well together. The committee decided, sort of like 7-to-1 kind of thing, that we had waited already 2 years because it had taken so long to have a conversation with the cemetery trustees to get the plaque, to get it carved and so forth, or it would take that long, that we were not willing to wait any longer. That people would bring their own response to it, and that we would not wait a year to take it through town meeting. It was not worth it. That does not mean that you have to agree with what the committee decided, because not everybody was fully in agreement. So that's where I wanted to end, except I forgot to play you a little bit of Roland Hayes. One of the things he was famous for, that he contributed, is he brought spirituals into the classical repertoire. And
Can you please repeat the date of the concert they had in Berlin where the hissing was?
there's a whole biography of him called Roland Hayes. It came out in December. It's fabulous, with every paragraph having several footnotes. But it's well written.
What decade was it?
In Berlin, it was in the 1920s.
Coming for carry me home, sweet low, sweet chariot, coming for carry me.
This is now, thank you, and questions and answers and comments. I do have a sign-up sheet, which you can, at the end, come up. And there are 2 ways to sign up. Just give your name and email. If you want to receive an email of an announcement, then that would probably be once every several months at most. Or if you want to volunteer, you put a check in the margin. We also have the 2-sided handout. One side is some readings, both children and adults. And then the stops on the walking tour, most of which you've already seen. This was done by one of the committee members a few years back, so there's a little bit of outdated information on the back about how to contact us. So the contact us information is here. And the co-chair of Hidden Brookline is sitting over there. I want to recognize Rob Daves, who is spearheading the plaque for Roland Hayes' house. And questions, comments? We have a few minutes. Yeah.
So just a quick one. Didn't you also put a warrant in front of the town?
We did.
Meeting in 2012?
Yeah, and we had the same problem with that same phrase. And we also didn't learn and put in sorrow instead of regret. It led to some good discussions in a number of things, because we weren't doing it to get people to say yes. We deliberately were doing it as an educational exercise to get town meeting members, talk about selectmen, the advisory committee, and so forth and so on. The other things we've done is we've done exhibits in all 3 libraries on slavery and freedom. We had an Ellen Kraft reenactment, powerful woman, standing room only in Hunneman Hall, and we worked with a 3rd grade curriculum, and we created a children's tour, and now in the fall we will have our first adult walking tour, now that we've done the pilot and found that they did not drop off after the first stop. Probably a few other things we've done. Oh, we have the website. Questions, comments?
Do you know in the old burying ground where the slaves are buried? I know there are no stones for that.
Those, you will find everybody that we know that is listed on our plaque is listed in Cummings' 1922 list of the old burying ground, which you can find online. And it lists people according to tomb or grave. And so when someone is not listed in a tomb or grave of a white owner, historical research strongly suggests that they were buried in the Potter's Field. And the Potter's Field, we know where the Potter's Field was, which is in the low part, in the oldest part of the cemetery, in the back of the low part, just beyond the big wall tombs.
Right. And a follow-up question, has there ever been any discussion now about some in that part of the cemetery?
We have not had a discussion, and that's something, other people can bring ideas to the committee or start up another kind of effort.
I'm on the board of something called Friends of the Old Burying Ground. That's what I'm asking, so I
Thank you,
certainly
because you
look
just
into
finished
that.
the wall tombs, you just finished repairing that.
Well, the town did that, but we are doing a number of activities, and the membership has changed so much, there may be some receptivity that there wouldn't have been a few years ago.
Yeah, things change. The DAR, when they, yeah, there are all kinds of things that change. I'm feeling positive about it, as, you know, the arc of justice is long, but it bends towards, whatever. Sorry. But it bends towards justice. So, also, one thing that's great on our website is Byron Rushing's talk on the danger of historical amnesia. I think we limited him to 3 minutes, so it's very brief. This was his talk at the unveiling of the plaque. Yes?
I just want to say at the high school, it's over to the public once a month, they have race reels.
Yeah.
And that's fantastic. It's youth and it's all generations, so it's nice. And they gather, it's in the MLK rooms in the high school.
It's very big of the week, and it's not actually everyone, it's over now.
Yeah.
If you look
Almost every month.
closer to, if you look closer to the time,
During
it's
the
not
school
always
year.
like the 3rd Friday or something like that.
But we could probably do a better job.
Yeah, if you look up race reels, you'll see often what the next thing is if you're close enough to the date, but I really wish the website would have the listing that, as you know it. Yeah, that'd be great.
We should make it better.
That's-
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a great initiative. Other comments? Yeah.
The Royal Family Homestead and Slave Quarters?
In Medford.
In Medford,
Yeah. Isaac Royal. Royal with 2 L's.
okay.
Yeah, it's quite extraordinary. Yeah.
Yeah, 3rd grade is good. Are you doing any other curriculum, especially at the 7th, 8th, or high school level? Because you would love to think that those 3rd graders remember it for a long time. And they understand it from a different perspective if they're, say, high school age.
The 3rd grade curriculum actually is a curriculum in a box. So it has a book about the early life of Harriet Tubman when she was a child in slavery, so that they can begin to sort of connect with somebody their own age. And then it also has a full outfit for a teacher to put on as Ellen Kraft. And there's a DVD to help them if they want to go on the tour. We're willing to help co-lead it with them. And then there's a day-by-day thing for 4 days. So it's detailed. For the older students, what Malcolm Cawthorn, who teaches social studies at the high school, has said to me, he said it is now seeped into US history at the high school. And he says what's interesting is his students, when he takes them to town hall or the cemetery plaque, they go, oh yeah, we heard about this before, especially the Lincoln students, because it's right there. But we didn't pay it any attention. And so they're, like you said, they're learning it again. So it's seeping in, but we haven't done anything formal for the 7th and 8th grade or for the high school department. But we've been in touch with them. And 3rd grade, because Massachusetts requires, and again, this is about hidden history, Massachusetts requires the study of the history of Massachusetts, history and geography in 3rd grade, and it says that there were 2 populations in Massachusetts in those times, Native Americans and whites. Whoops. So I went to Jeff Tagnell, the social studies coordinator, who had gone to the state archives with me to do some of this research, and said, Jeff, what should we do about it? He says, oh, let's go. And so we did professional development, we did the curriculum and so forth. It was a lot of fun. And they did most of the curriculum, we just helped. Thank you very much for coming. I'd be happy to stay around for 2 years.